All right, so the last group that we want to talk about is African Americans and how the war affected them. So the wartime message of freedom portended a major transformation in the status of Black Americans. However, Washington remained rigidly segregated. The Red Cross still refused to mix blood from blacks and whites in blood banks, leading some critics to charge that they were in effect accepting Nazi race theories. One chief critic of this practice was, in fact, an African-American scientist, Charles Drew, who pioneered the technique of storing and shipping blood plasma. The war itself ultimately spurred a movement of the Black population from the rural South to cities of the North and West. This migration dwarfed the Great Migration of the First World War in 1920s. However, they still encountered a sometimes violent hostility, especially in Detroit. In Detroit, residents forced authorities to evict Black tenants from housing projects, and in 1943, a fight at a city park escalated into a race riot that left 34 people dead and a hate strike of nearly 20,000 workers protesting the upgrading of Black workers in defense plants. When the war broke out, the Air Force and the Marines had no Black servicemen at all. The Army allowed the enlistment of Black servicemen, but they were limited in number, while the Navy limited them to only positions as cooks or waiters. During the war, over 1 million Black Americans served in the armed forces, largely in segregated units and largely confined to non-combat roles. Black soldiers sometimes were required to give up their seats on railroad cars to accommodate Nazi prisoners of war, which apparently validated to those Nazis their racial beliefs. As veterans of the war came home and tried to take advantage of the GI Bill, they also encountered even more evidence of racial discrimination in the United States. The GI Bill itself contained no explicit racial differentiation, but the bill was largely administered by local authorities, and those local authorities were able to administer the bill in such a way as to place racial limitations on its provisions. The war years ultimately witnessed the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Angered by the almost complete exclusion of African Americans from jobs in the rapidly expanding war industries, for example, of the 100,000 aircraft workers in 1940, only 300 of them were Black. In July of 1941, Black labor leader A. Philip Randolph called for a march on Washington. The prospect of thousands of angry marchers descending on Washington ultimately scared the government. And in order to persuade Randolph to call off the march, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802. and created FEPC, or the Fair Employment Practices Commission. The executive order banned discrimination in defense jobs, and the FEPC was created to monitor compliance. By 1944, more than 1 million African Americans, and nearly 300,000 of them women, held manufacturing jobs in the defense industries. During the war, the NAACP grew its membership exponentially from just around 50,000 to nearly 500,000 members. A smaller group within the organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, held sit-ins to try and integrate restaurants and theaters. In February of 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier coined the phrase that ultimately came to symbolize Black attitudes during the war. The double V meant that victory over Germany and Japan must also be accompanied by a victory over segregation at home. Where FDR and the white press saw the war as an expression of American ideals, the Black press pointed to the gap between those ideals and reality. Freedom was a goal to be achieved rather than a right to be defended. During the war, a broad political coalition centered on the left, but reaching well beyond it, called for an end to racial inequality in America. The NAACP and the American Jewish Congress cooperated closely in advocating laws to ban discrimination in jobs and housing. CIO unions made significant efforts to organize Black workers and win them access to skilled positions, despite some considerable resistance from rank-and-file white workers. The new Black militancy, however, was alarming to some Southern politicians. The war, exclaimed Alabama Governor Frank Dixon, should not be used as a pretext to bring about the abolition of the color line. The South reacted to preserve white supremacy. Even as the war was giving birth to the modern civil rights movement, it also served to plant the seeds of massive resistance to that movement in the South that would ultimately follow the war as well. While progress was slow, it was measurable. The National War Labor Board banned racial wage differentials. The Supreme Court, in the case of Smith versus Albright, outlawed all white primaries, which were a common method in Southern states to bar Black Americans from voting. In 1944, the Navy began assigning small numbers of Black sailors to previously all-white ships, and by the end of the war, ended segregation altogether. The Army also established a few integrated combat units. Perhaps nothing reflected the new concern with the status of Black Americans more than the publication of An American Dilemma in 1944 by Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal. This was a sprawling account of the country's racial past, present, and future, and because it was written by a foreigner, its observations are of American society from the outside. The book offers an uncompromising portrait of just how entrenched racism was in the United States. Myrdal notes that the conflict between American values and American racial policies is profound. His observations, however, are hardly new. Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois had both said much the same thing earlier. However, within the context of the worldwide struggle against Nazism and rising demands for equality at home, the book struck a chord within American society. Identified as a serious national problem, the book also seemed to offer an almost painless path to peaceful change. America would have to outlaw discrimination. In the first decades of the 20th century, a Black international consciousness was also reinvigorated. The global imposition of white supremacy brought forth a feeling of racial solidarity across national and geographic lines. And leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and others developed an outlook that linked the plight of Black Americans with that of people of color worldwide. World War II stimulated among African Americans a greater awareness of the links between racism in the United States and colonialism abroad. Freeing Africa from colonial rule led many African Americans to believe that it would also help to encourage greater equality at home. And these are just the beginning seeds of what would grow to become one of the most successful civil rights movements in history.